I think finally at the end we just grow pigs, and we have to do the best of what we know to serve our the pigs that we are going to raise. So what I will do today is go over the requirements and how those has been established, and if you go and has a problem, or you want to know how much phosphorus or vitamin D or calcium should I feed some pigs, then how has that been established? So the nutritional management of calcium, phosphorus, and vitamin D has major 4 items that I can think of, right? Managing the lean growth of the animal, so how much muscle the animal deposits, the bone strength, what Dr. Crenshaw was mentioning. However, we have to manage diet cost and the environment. And one thing I want to remind you is that not just because we want to put more phosphorus, we're going to make a better function of our farms, because we may just dump in more phosphorus to the environment too. So this is something to watch of, that these 4 characteristics need to be taken into account. Therefore, what I have thought for this seminar today is that we go over overview of the dietary requirements of vitamin D, calcium, and phosphorus, check how do we measure those concentrations, and see how those premixes are put together. And if you want to go out and forget about this presentation, if you get these 3 items in mind, I think I will have made my work today. I want to introduce you that the requirements are not a fixed number, that the concentrations varies among feed ingredients, and that the premixes have some room to account for the uncertainties. So as the previous speakers talk about, there are some cases have been talked about hypovitaminosis D. However, not all may be due just to low levels of vitamin D, because there is a tight interplay of these 3 nutrients, and therefore we're going to go over this review. The most recent overview that I can do is for you is follow the current NRC 2012. We can look at the usefulness of some models that have been developed and review the requirements of vitamin D for bone management or growth and health. So first of all, if we want to know how to feed or what should we feed to an animal, we have to know what is in the diet, what is on the feed. And we know that the concentration of phosphorus and calcium in grain cereals, for example, is bound to something called phytate. I think Darren mentioned very quick about it. And about 60% can be found as a phytate, and pigs cannot, unless it's that genetically modified pig from Guelph that actually express phytase enzymes in their saliva. No pigs can do this. Mostly microbes can do this. And the phytase enzymes are added to the feed to release that phosphorus. And that phosphorus or the release is being measured on phytase units, and I will explain you a little bit coming soon. But the commercial products vary in their activity on how much phytase, the phosphorus they release from phytase. We can reduce the inorganic forms of phosphorus that we add to the diet, so we can manage total excretion of phosphorus to the environment, and we can manage diet cost. So therefore we can excrete or manage the amount of phosphorus excreted into the environment. So if phosphorus changes in their concentration among feed ingredients, how do we measure that? Well, there has been, you can just measure the total concentration of phosphorus, and hopefully I will convince you today that will tell you some but not the whole story. You can measure the available phosphorus, and that has been the traditional way of measuring phosphorus concentration. But more recently, we have adopted the way of measuring phosphorus as a digestible basis. So here is an example of how those values come into play in common feed ingredients. We have corn, soybean meal, distilled extract grain with solubles, dicalcium phosphates, and monocalcium phosphate. And you can see that the total concentration of calcium and phosphorus varies. Plant-based material has part of their phosphorus bound to phytate, and therefore the digestibility varies among them, is also lower than the indigestibility that you will observe from a mineral source of phosphorus and calcium. So traditionally what was done is a slope ratio assay, and this is a very common nutritional tool, very expensive and tedious to work because you have to feed multiple levels of your test material and have a response variable. And in this case, for example, we can have bone strength as a response variable, and many times has been done actually with bone ash, and maybe hopefully after we heard today, we move forward to bone strength. But you have multiple inclusion levels or intake. Actually, the intake want to refer that animals do not have a amount of nutrient in the diet per kilogram of diet. They actually have grams per day requirement. And intake is something that is very, very important. So we feed the multiple levels of a standard ingredient. We get a regression line, and then we get a we get the slope of that line, and we get the slope for the test material, let's say corn. And we are feeding here monocalcium phosphate, and we see how the animal responds in the strength. We do a ratio of the two, and we say, well, the amount of available calcium in corn is 50% of that available calcium in phosphorus. And that's how the system was developed for many years. You can see that the amount of total phosphorus that you will put in the diet may vary with the type of formulation that you use. If you formulate the diet, and these are examples for typical corn soybean meal diet, on total phosphorus basis or on available phosphorus basis, that you are adding 10 or 20% dry distillers grains with soluble. Remember that I mentioned that the variation or the digestibility of phosphorus varies, right? And the digestibility and the availability will change. You can see that total phosphorus in the diet is reduced, but actually we are keeping constant the amount of phosphorus that we will be feeding to the animal. So with this, what I want to tell you is that total phosphorus concentration of the diet does not tell you the whole story of what the animal is actually going to use the phosphorus for. And then moving forward to a available phosphorus system will help you to move towards a more accurate measurement that will help to reduce phosphorus intake and phosphorus incretion into the environment. However, there has been some flaws in the availability of phosphorus system because you always compare against a standard material, and that standard material varies from experiment to experiment. If I do an experiment today, that standard curve is developed one way, and then if I do it in another with another feed ingredient, the standard curve can change. And that has been one of the flaws or criticism to the availability system. So we have changed to a system called digestibility and accounts for the undigested phosphorus, and that is a way of moving forward on the digestibility system. Simply what we do, we put pigs in what is called metabolism cages, where we can do quantitatively collections of feces. So we feed the animals, see how much they are eating minus excretion divided by intake. That's the digestibility, and that's what is called the apparent digestibility. However, if I feed my animal and measure how much phosphorus and calcium are in the feces, part of what is in the feces come from endogenous losses. So it comes from the body itself of the animal. So some phosphorus can be reabsorbed and put back, dumped into the feces of the animal. So that's the loss of endogenous losses. And this is a very similar to the amino acid digestibility, where we correct for what we call the basal endogenous losses. So if we see the intake and the outflow, there are losses that do not depend on intake, and those are the ones that we correct for in the standardized digestibility process. So then we take intake minus excretion minus the endogenous losses divided by intake. Then that will be the system that the NRC is putting forward to measure digestibility of phosphorus. And it has an advantage that now, if you add in phytate enzymes, for example, you can measure the digestibility of phosphorus with adding the enzyme. And this is just an example of diets that we put together for one experiment. And what I want to show you is, look at a diet putting even 40% distillers grains, and we can see how the total phosphorus changes in the diet. And however, the total standardized digestibility of phosphorus that we're putting, the amount of digestible phosphorus is lower. So it would be that then we're feeding these animals still to the requirement. What about vitamins? Since we're talking about calcium, phosphorus, and vitamins, how are vitamins measured? And traditionally, for vitamins, what has been done is a slope ratio 2, where the outcome variable can be growth, but sometimes can be enzymatic activity, or can be bond strength. It can be tied to other outcome variables. But basically, vitamins has been measured that way. And in the case of vitamin D, it is expressed as an international unit, which is 0.025 microgram of cholecalciferol. And then any other new different source of vitamin should be compared to that amount, or how much activity do they have compared to that vitamin cholecalciferol. And many factors affect that final concentration on the premixes. So Darren was mentioning that they had taken products and follow those products through the long term, and they saw that there was an effect of time on reducing the amount of vitamin D in the premix. And yes, humidity, sunlight exposure, heat, pH, presence of antioxidant agents, even the type of inorganic trace minerals can have an impact on the concentration or the availability of the vitamins in the premix. Therefore, under practical conditions for most of pig diet, the final concentration of the premix are 2 to 3 times even greater levels that you will find by recommended NRC levels. So that's on the side of the grain, right? How do we assess and measure how much the grain? Now, how do we know how much the animal will require? Now, there would be no standard recommendation. Pigs of this body weight will require this amount of phosphorus in the diet. That has changed, and what is being put forward is a calculation so that the value is dynamic as the animal grows. And that calculation, this is going to be the only equation that I put here, but it's a function of the animal body weight and the dry matter intake and the capacity of the animal for retained phosphorus, and a factor that is 0.85. And this 0.85 is the amount of phosphorus that will be required for optimal lean growth, which is lower than the amount of phosphorus that is required for bone strength. So the animal can consume 85% of the phosphorus that will be necessary for optimal bone strength and be used that for lean growth. And the reason that the NRC committee went that way, and Dr. Crenshaw may explain that later, but is that we're looking for lean growth of the animal. It was the outcome variable, is part of the outcome variables. One thing that I want to point you is the impact of dry matter intake, and the intake of the animal is very important to keep track. This is the amount of phosphorus that we're going to supply in the diet in grams per day of that animal, right? And that's how much the animal needs to consume. Now, if my farm animals have a great feed consumption, or in your farm has a different feed consumption, then that needs to be adjusted, and that should be monitored. And remember, I was mentioning to you about the phytate enzymes. So the amount and the release of phosphorus that can be available to the animal from phytates is different on the different products. For example, these are phytase units or concentration of the phytase on the diet, and this is the apparent total tract digestibility of phosphorus. And we can see that for product number 2, that release may be very fast and it kind of plateau. For product number 3, goes more like linear. So different products has different effect on the release of phosphorus and should be kept track of. If my feed mill runs out of this enzyme and all of a sudden I put this one and assume that it's going to be the same, that could be part of the way we're getting into trouble, right? And our feed mill should be keep track of those things. So the requirement for vitamin D were actually updated. We tend to say they were not updated, but actually they were updated, but the information has been basically from all review papers. So it has been increased for sows. For grower, pigs is 220 international units, and for finisher, 150 international units. And that's the current recommendations. There's been questioning of those recommendations for vitamin D because, as Darren was mentioning you before, he had observed that pigs growing outdoors has much greater levels of vitamin D in their blood. But we have to make sure we establish what criteria we're going to use to define whether we are going to use what we're used to define the requirement for vitamin D. Bone strengths were used in the past, but now there seems that there can be a relationship of vitamin D with health and production. One of those has been antibody production that's been observed. Certainly, if we put vitamin D or if we supplement vitamin D to the animals, we can see that they get greater serum levels of 25-hydroxy-D3. For example, at birth, 10 days of birth, and then at weaning, pigs that have been supplemented, they do get greater levels of vitamin D. And one thing that I want you to point is that you can tell, and for many experiments that I have seen people tracking serum levels of vitamin D in pigs that have been supplemented, most of the time there seems that also they go down. And I have not calculated, but maybe the rate that they go down is faster than the rate that it goes down in the pigs that have not been supplemented, meaning that the animals maybe actually do not need all that vitamin D. In some cases, that supplementation has been observed as an improvement in growth. For example, we have here at 21, 28, and 47 days of age, and the body weight of these pigs supplemented with 40,000 units of vitamin D were actually greater. But it is inconsistent. So this is work from University of Kentucky, and they were supplementing also 40,000 units of vitamin D, and they observed that the average daily gain of those pigs was not different. So what could be one explanation is that what is the body using that vitamin D for can be changing in different cases. So while for intestinal absorption of calcium, for example, is what we usually established, or the requirements were established and done on healthy animals, it could be and has been demonstrated from human literature that vitamin D has a role in immune functions. So can the vitamin D be repartition or being used during health challenges away from its regular functions on calcium absorption and be used for other functions? Maybe, and that could be why some animals just get through and present issues, as Darren was mentioning. But the other case also is that as animals usually go through immune challenges, then they go also over periods of anorexia, and reduced feed intake is also reducing the amount of nutrients getting into the animal. How fast can the animal recover from that depletion of nutrients? maybe they can recover very fast for lean growth, but for bone growth, that recovery may be even slower, right? So in conclusion, the dietary requirements for calcium and phosphorus are dynamic. As I mentioned, 2 points I want you to remember. The NRC has adjusted the total amount of phosphorus in the body times 0.85, so accounting that 85% will be required for optimal lean growth and not for optimal strength. And they have used a value of 0.77 as the capacity of the animal of retaining phosphorus. And those are 2 parts where we could do more work on determining whether that varies from different farm conditions. Constant monitoring and adjustment of the diet formulations and the concentration of nutrients in our diet. Keep in mind that not all phytates are made equal. There are nutritional models, and I didn't go more into this, but there are people been working on developing models of digestion so that we can better understand how these phytase enzymes work. New parameters, for example, to account for animal health may be needed for accounting for those times where the animals get sick or when they go through a period of depletion or low levels of phosphorus and how they recover. Those has not been taken into account yet.